opportunity to speak with you about EPIC's work on artificial intelligence. For people who are not familiar with my organization, we were established 25 years ago to focus on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues. Rather than write an annual report, we produce a word cloud, so you can see the topics that we're working on. Of relevance to this group, of course, is algorithmic transparency, but also social scoring, which I'll come to in a moment. We have been very interested in the AI policy field for a number of years, but I will say partly inspired by an article that I read about Governor Dukakis a few years ago calling for an international convention on AI, we stepped up our efforts, and we now consider this to be our priority issue. I'm going to say a little bit more about this letter that was published earlier this year in the New York Times, setting out our concerns about where the U.S. is on AI, but also recognizing some progress. Quickly, and by way of background, one of the first campaigns we had launched was in support of algorithmic transparency, which we viewed as a cornerstone principle to hold AI-based systems accountable. As part of our campaign, we actually produced screen cleaners, which are on the table over here. Our theory was that you could not fix the code if you could not see the code. That tends to work well in campaigning, as do nice laptop stickers. Some people really like this phrase, Bayesian determinations are not justice. I didn't fully understand it, but I went with them, so those stickers are available as well. As we were pursuing our grassroots efforts in support of human rights protections for AI-based systems, we were simultaneously working with international organizations, including the OECD in Paris, to develop a policy framework for the OECD member nations. I've served as an expert on a number of OECD frameworks going back more than 25 years. And the OECD had recognized just a few years ago that AI was going to be an increasingly important issue for national governments. We had a series of meetings with the 36 member countries. They announced in May of this year a set of framework principles that are briefly outlined here. I'll pause on this slide for a moment so you can see that the first principle for the OECD countries is that AI should benefit people and the planet. It's generally understood as the human-centric principle. The OECD said AI systems should respect the rule of law, human rights, and democratic values, which is a principle that we had pushed for and thought was absolutely critical for democratic nations to support. We had transparency incorporated in the OECD framework. We talked about systems that were robust, secure, and safe, and then also a sense of accountability for organizations and businesses that were deploying AI-based systems. As I said, this actually fits in a sequence of international frameworks that the OECD has set out, which have in fact been quite influential. It's an interesting organization. The OECD principles are non-binding, but they are, as soft law, as international norms, very influential, and oftentimes are adopted into national law or form the basis of international agreements. So almost immediately, one of our next tasks will be to assess the incorporation of the OECD AI principles into national law, and we've set up an observatory for that process. Indeed, the process moved forward quite quickly, because when the G20 nations met in June this past year in Osaka, just a month after the OECD had announced the principles, the G20 nations effectively endorsed the OECD AI principles as AI policy approach that they would seek to follow as well. I should mention, by the way, a lot of the slides I'm putting up here today, the primary source materials are available on the EPIC site or at our bookstore. I'll also post for Tuan and others the slides so you can get access to them. But the text of the G20 declaration, I think, is remarkable. And you'll see a real desire to engage the policy challenges of AI. We recognize that AI, like other emerging technologies, may present challenges, including to labor markets, privacy, security, and ethical issues. To foster public trust and confidence, we are committed to the human-centered approach to AI, and this references the OECD policy framework, as well as ongoing concerns about privacy. So in one respect, I think this is now an international baseline for AI policy frameworks. When we talk about subsequent developments in national law or international agreement, the starting point will likely be the framework that the OECD has announced, that the G20 has endorsed, as a reference to try to understand what more needs to be done, either in the articulation of policy goals or in the implementation of these policy goals that have been announced. But on the one hand, while I should be cheering the outcome, I will tell you frankly that we also felt that the OECD principles are incomplete. And so while we were working with the OECD in support of this policy framework, we were simultaneously developing a human rights-based framework for AI, which came to be known as the Universal Guidelines for AI. We have this nice photo featuring Tuan from our conference in Brussels a little bit more than a year ago. He's seated on a panel, by the way. I should mention Helen Dixon, who's to my left, is the Chief Privacy Commissioner for Ireland. To Tuan's left is Elizabeth Denham, who is the Chief Privacy Commissioner for the UK, probably the most influential privacy official right now in the world. It's actually her office that was responsible for the Cambridge Analytica investigation. So we've conducted this policy dialogue on the human rights front at a high level, engaging public officials and technical experts and seeking to promote, frankly, a broader understanding of the requirements we believe that need to be adopted to safeguard human rights in the AI era. You can find the guidelines at the Public Voice website. That's the preamble. And you'll see quite a bit more detail than what the OECD had announced. One of the issues that we actually wrestled with was the notion of the scoring of individuals. And we asked the question, do you regulate scoring? Do you prohibit scoring? I mean, we have in the United States many firms that score people on a wide range of activities. Grading is a form of scoring, of course. So a prohibition on scoring would seem an odd thing to do. Nonetheless, there was a strong sense in the group that put together this framework that a single score issued by a government regarding its citizens was a form of stigma, almost like a soft criminal sentence. And so we actually announced in this framework a prohibition on what we call unitary scoring. We have just decided that the social scoring system of China has crossed a line and should be opposed. And we believe democratic governments should rally in support of that proposition. We've also put forward what we call the termination obligation. It's a bit of a movie reference, but it's also a recognition that if you deploy an AI system, you are ultimately responsible for the consequences of that system that you choose to deploy. And we have a real concern that in the development of autonomous and semi-autonomous systems, there will be a tendency for governments and for organizations to cede authority and to cede control. And we want to make very clear at this moment in time that you will always remain responsible for systems that you put in place. In fact, the degree of responsibility increases as the complexity and the opacity of the system increases. The work becomes more difficult, but that actually underscores the responsibility to be prepared to act. And as I said, these 12 principles set out in the Universal Guidelines for AI are intended as a more comprehensive approach to the challenges that AI systems present than what the OECD and the G20 countries have so far managed. Now, one of the practical challenges in this field, as I'm sure you all are aware, is that there is there must be a software app out there titled AI Ethics Policy Framework Maker, because the number of AI ethics and policy frameworks is just growing, daily. Every organization, institution, government is wrestling with this issue and going through what I think is an important exercise to try to understand what their principles or approach will be. We decided last year to publish what I believe was the first reference book containing the significant AI policy frameworks that we had identified. I have the 1999 edition over there, and the 2020 edition just came out this past week. But you'll see in this book the international frameworks that the OECD and the Council of Europe have introduced. You'll see the national frameworks, including the President's executive order on AI strategy. You'll see the frameworks from the professional societies, such as the ACM and the IEEE and others, as well as our own human rights frameworks, the Universal Guidelines for AI. And our aim is to try to create a context in which it's possible to have a conversation about what policy frameworks should look like. Because I would say at this moment in time, it's actually very difficult to do that type of comparative analysis that makes possible a meaningful evaluation. And of course, there are now meta-studies of AI policy frameworks. I know the Berkman Center has done one. They identified 183. A friend of mine in Australia, Roger Clark, has done one. He's identified 60 different themes in AI policy frameworks. We put both the Berkman study and Roger's study in our source book, making our source book a meta study of AI policy. But we hope that will be useful to you. And you may be wondering, well, what are some of the current themes? I mean, if you think about AI policy, there's a lot out there. As I said, Roger's study proposed 60 different unique criteria. I'm just highlighting a few. One is that there's clearly a spectrum between law, which will have binding force on actors, and ethics, which tend to be aspirational. At one end we have standards, and at the other end we have principles. Human-centric comes up in many of these AI policy frameworks. In fact, I think I would credit the Japanese government, which in 2016 produced one of the first policy proposals for AI at the G7 meeting. And human-centric was an important theme at that G7 meeting in 2016. It's been carried forward in many of the frameworks since. Of course, governments are looking for growth, not only job growth, but you see frequent references to sustainable growth and innovation. Human rights concerns are sometimes summarized as fairness, accountability, and transparency. And then, of course, the OECD highlights democratic governance, rule of law, and fundamental rights. In the introduction, both to the 1999 version and the 2020 version, I provided a brief narrative commentary to try to explain some of the key tensions we had also identified. And one is clearly growing, I don't know if this is a bifurcation, but between a democratic governance concept of AI and an authoritarian concept of AI. And the simple way I would say to understand this is that there's a lot of enthusiasm in the West among democratic societies for so-called smart cities. The Chinese government is very interested also in the deployment of digital techniques in modern urban settings. But they don't use the phrase smart cities in the various Belt and Road proposals. They talk about secure cities, which have a somewhat different aim than might smart cities. All right, I'm going to say, got a bit more to cover. We've been doing a lot of interesting work. We're very interested in the development of AI policy that the public has the opportunity to meaningfully participate, because we are concerned about a relationship between government and the private sector that tends to exclude the public from meaningful decision-making. And for that reason, beginning in 2018, we had launched a campaign with scientific societies, including the AAAS and ACM and IEEE, to ensure that the US policy process would incorporate public opinion. And we were making progress, particularly with the US Office of Science and Technology Policy, which had an open public comment process. But then we ran into some difficulty with a new entity that was created by the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018, called the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Are people here familiar with this commission? Yes, no? Oh, well, that's few. Sandy is, and you are. Okay, good. Well, this is an important entity, and it is specifically tasked with making recommendations for the President and Congress regarding AI policy. And our view is that it was necessary for this entity to reach out to the public and to observe open records laws and open meeting laws, as would other federal commissions. And by the way, the approach that has been taken in other countries, including Canada, France, Germany, Japan, has typically been inclusive of public opinion. The commission, not so much. They issued an interim report just a month ago. The co-chairs, Eric Schmidt and Robert Wark, I'm sure some of you know, outlining the responsibilities of the Commission to consider the methods and means necessary to advance the development of AI in the United States, but refused to be subject to open records laws. And you may be wondering, well, what exactly are you concerned about? They have all these experts, they're 15 different people, they just had a public meeting. What's the worry here? Well, if you read the report carefully, which we did, you find buried in some of the footnotes a very sharp criticism of the European approach to privacy protection, which is known as the GDPR. You find a statement that says that it may be necessary for the US to gain access to personal data held in the federal government to be able to compete, for example, with China in medical research, which I would say is a very controversial proposition. And you also see a very select disclosure of the experts and consultants that the Commission met with during the course of its 200 closed-door meetings. So, as we like to do in Washington, we sue people. We sued the AI Commission, and we won. This is just a couple weeks ago. We got an opinion, thank you. Privacy group gets okay to seek federal AI panel's records. And it's actually very good. 23-page opinion from a judge who writes at one point, like a stranger offering candy to a child, the government invites this court to ignore what the law actually says. That's a judge with a sense of humor. It's a good thing he's on our side and not the other side. So we're going to be getting the records of the AI Commission, and we're going to try to find out more why it is that this commission thinks that the government should get access to personal data held by the federal government. It's also from our website. We followed almost immediately the court's decision. Oh, that's actually the original. No, that's following the court's decision, but these are the controversial issues that we've identified in that report. A few more items for you just to be aware of. As I said, in Washington, we like to sue people. It's an alternative to exercise, I guess. And we brought a complaint to the Federal Trade Commission regarding a firm called HireVue, widely used, I think also by many universities, to assess job applicants has a proprietary AI technique that, among other things, does an assessment of a person's facial image to decide whether or not they're qualified to obtain a job. And we raised concerns about that, but as a legal matter, we said this could well be an unfair and deceptive trade practice, and we asked the FTC to take a look at it. In a bit of innovative lawyering, we also said to the FTC that you need to consider the OECD AI principles as what are called established public policies, a form of soft law that we want the agency to now take account of as it assesses AI-based business practices. It's kind of neat, actually. We sort of created the soft law, and then we go to the commission, the agency, and we say, now take account of that soft law. And if we succeed, then you have new law that safeguards individuals. That particular case actually got a lot of attention. This is Forbes writing about our efforts to learn more about the use of AI in employment screening. We're looking at AI in pretrial risk assessment. We have a series of open government requests to various correctional agencies at the state level that are producing scores for judges to tell the judge this person should get 6 months and this person should get 2 years. And the judge says, well, what is the basis of that determination? And the prosecutor says, well, that's a proprietary technique. We actually can't explain that to you, but trust us, it has high predictive value, so you should rely on it. It turns out, if you do FOIA requests to the state correctional agencies that are reviewing these systems, internally, they are expressing concerns about the use of automated risk assessment techniques because the outcomes don't align with what they would anticipate would happen. And you only find that out if you go to the state level, which we've done in Nebraska and Idaho and elsewhere, to try to understand the consequences of AI. Okay, I'm going to kind of wrap up here, but also tell you about the next campaign, and if we're successful, maybe have another good story to tell in a year or two. It's become increasingly clear to us that the one area of rapid AI deployment that seems to raise the most fundamental human rights concerns is actually face recognition. And we didn't come to that conclusion alone. I mean, this is a report from the New York Times this spring. My letter, which I actually was responding to the New York Times report in the spring, says, 1 month, 500,000 face scans, how China is using AI to profile a minority in a major ethical leap for, interesting phrase, ethical leap. For the tech world, Chinese startups have built algorithms that the government uses to track members of a largely Muslim minority group. And the Chinese government has drawn wide international condemnation for its harsh crackdown on ethnic Muslims in the Western region, including holding as many as 1 million of them in detention camps. What is so troubling about this development is the role that technology is playing in extending control over a minority population. And the economic push behind the firms that are developing these techniques is not incidental. This is Wired, writing in September, one of China's highly valued facial recognition startups has filed for an IPO. Most of its revenue comes from a unit selling surveillance and security systems. And here you see a very nice representation of this social scoring system in China. To be able to see someone in a public space, identify them, and then assign to them a rating as to essentially their loyalty to the government, yes? Because that's really at its core what this score is. It's the loyalty to the government. That is a future that in some parts of the world is the present. And this is playing out somewhere else that we should be concerned about, and that's in Hong Kong. If you've been following the protest in Hong Kong, this is a protest that's actually taking place in 2 different centuries. It's taking place in the 20th century because you can see protesters on the street and you can see police containing protesters, and sometimes you can see a physical attack. But it's also taking place in the 21st century because the streets are surrounded by surveillance cameras, and facial recognition is being used to identify people in public spaces, and protesters are covering their faces, and cases are going to the Hong Kong court, as they did recently, to decide whether or not protesters have the right to wear those masks to conceal their identity over a British law that said that people may not conceal their identity in a public space. Good news, by the way, on that case, the Hong Kong court ruled that people do have the right to conceal their identity in public space. That is entirely a response to surveillance techniques that are now being used to crack down on protests in Hong Kong. Anyway, here I am. I was speaking in Tirana. Do you know what Tirana is? It's the capital of Albania. And I was in Albania for the annual meeting of the Data Protection Commissioners, and I was urging the Data Protection Commissioners to endorse a resolution in support of a moratorium on facial recognition, because I believe that this is the #1 human rights concern today in the deployment of AI techniques. We've launched a campaign. There's a reference here actually to the Chinese scoring system in the image, because of course it's not simply identification in public spaces that's taking place, it's also an assessment that's taking place of the individual. And I guess when I close my talks, I always like to ask people to do something. So I'm going to close my talk today by saying, if you are concerned about this issue, recognizing the full potential of AI for innovation and growth and research, which I think we all share, but nonetheless are prepared to take action when you see the use of AI that is not favorable to human society, I would ask you to sign our declaration, which is available online. It calls for a moratorium on facial recognition technology for mass surveillance. We have so far about 500 experts around the world, more than 100 organizations in more than 40 countries, and we will, on this site, be tracking developments and keeping you up to date. So thank you very much for your time, and please take some of our materials.
Mark, could I